Good evening, everyone. We are back in the book of Isaiah. We are now in chapter 2, and we left chapter 1, and it was a relatively long session, but I needed to do that so that we could have a better, clearer picture as we move along the next few chapters in the book of Isaiah. In chapter 2, as you can tell from chapter 1, I had alluded to the fact that we're not moving in a chronological progression. Uh, I had also indicated that chapter 6 is most likely the first of the chronology of the ministry of Isaiah. I guess when we start off in chapter 1, it would be very similar to how I guess many movies are like. No, it goes through the current scenario, and then it gives you it brings you back to the beginning, like 3 months ago, kind of picture. And so chapter 1 is very much most likely at the time of Hezekiah, probably after the 7th year of his reign, when the northern kingdom has already been conquered by the Assyrians. Now we go on to chapter 2. And chapter 2 now gives us another picture, not necessarily a continuation, but possibly because it's regarding Judah and Jerusalem, which means that we're still looking at the southern kingdom in particular. Now, the first thing that I want to point out to you is this word. The word in Hebrew is davar. Now, the word davar is quite different from how we would use the English word. The idea of davar comes from the imagery of lining up letters together. And when you line up letters in a sequence, you make a word. But as it is used in the Hebrew context, it is not just merely expressing word, but expressing the thought behind the word, expressing the matter, the issue. It could be a promise or a command, but it is called a word. But it is a word that Yeshayahu, Isaiah, the son of Amos, was looking, and this word saw, and I bring you to yesterday's session. This would be a word called Hadza. Let me write it down. Hadza. Hadza literally means a special ability, or possibly we call it a divine ability, that was given to Isaiah and the prophets when God wants to reveal things to them. Now, God interacts with men in many different ways, and I was given the understanding that there are no less than 10 words that is used to express such interactions. And one of them is this, the hadza, the ability to see. So it's not a normal see something. It's not the physical realm of seeing, but it's seeing beyond the physical. And I was made to understand that every time you see this word, something important and something extraordinary, and sometimes in a more negative way would be expressed. However, in verse 2 onwards, you would get the theme that God provides through the prophets. We have covered Habakkuk, Amos, Haggai, Micah, and now in in Isaiah, and Isaiah is Yeshayahu. There is this theme that we always see, that when God rebukes them, chastises them, scolds them, warns them, threatens them, there is always the final hope that is given. And that is a picture and a vision painted of the ultimate that would be after all these impending destruction and punishment. And that's what we see in verse 2. Now, in verse 2, pay attention to these words. It shall come to pass in the latter days. The word latter days would be the end of days. End of days. The word latter really means the time that comes right at the end. And in theology, people have big words for it, and it's typically called a Greek name, eschatology. But whenever the Hebrew Bible explains latter days, it talks about the time where things will be, well, I would say, literally perfect. And God paints that picture of the utopia of the future. Now, beginning in verse 2, I would ask you to read Micah chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. If you haven't joined us in the book of Micah, we did this last Monday, and these are words that is virtually identical. Now, virtually identical doesn't mean it is identical to every single word in Hebrew, but it's almost there. Now, also understand that Micah is a contemporary of Isaiah. And Micah was talking about the time when after all the punishments have come, where after the Babylonians have come by. Now, in this case, the Babylonians are about to come. And through Isaiah, we read about the end of days, not the impending destructions, but way down the road, that the mountain of the Lord's house, remember this would be the temple. And we all would try to figure out, why would the temple still be around? Well, in the Old Testament terms, the temple is always around. And in our terms today, when we look at this is likely to be the third temple, because the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE. It shall be established on the top of the mountains. It shall be exalted above the hills. Now, when you read something like this is an A and a B. It is talking about something right at the highest point, at the top, exalted above. That tells us that at the end of the day, if this was the mountain, then the Lord's house will be established here, so that it can be seen from great distances away. The next thing that is described here is this, that all nations shall flow to it. By nations, we understand this to be non-Israel. So in the end days, what do we see? We see this. We see people, this word flow, by the way, right here, flow, means a river, or a stream. And so in the English word, we use stream to give us an imagery of people moving in a particular direction. And so one of the imagery that we see is this, that if these were all people, okay, and they are all going up the hill, and basically that's the picture we are getting. People are going up the hill. In a normal flow of a river, water always flow downhill. But in the latter days, in the end days, the top would be God's temple, and the people will flow up the mountain. That's the picture, that the nations will come to God. Verse 3, it says, many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. Again, whenever you read words like this, these are all geographical terms. We go down to Egypt, and from Egypt, we go up to Canaan. Now, in this case, we go up to the mountain of the Lord, meaning this is down and this is up. And that's the direction it's going. So all of these is going, it tells us the general direction. Where are they going? To the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. Why? So this is the two, A and B. They're going to the house of the Lord. And when they go up to the house of the Lord, the question that we all probably would ask is, what are they doing there? And so now in verse 3, we have these words that he will teach us his way. The word to teach is yara. His ways would be the ways of which we are supposed to walk. Yara is to point the finger. And this gives us the imagery of direction. All right. The one who points the finger is called the more. And so he is called the teacher. It's from the same. Now, when you continue reading, we shall walk in his paths. He teach us his ways, and we walk in his path is another A and B. Next, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, from Jerusalem. This is another A and B. So the next word that I want to point out to you is law. This is Torah. Torah comes from the word yara. So these are all words that's based on each other. The word yara would be the base root word. So Torah literally means instructions or directions. And hence, the direction of God or the instructions of God literally comes here. So God teaches the Torah so that the people who comes to him will learn to walk in his path. And this word law is in a synonym with the word of the Lord. Zion with Jerusalem. And so the idea here is it gives us an imagery of the davar of the Lord, which is this word, davar. The things that God is saying, the things that God is teaching is the Torah. So I urge us to try very hard to put aside our contemporary notion that Torah is law. Torah is not law. Torah is basically instructions and directions on how God wants us to live. That is why these words are penned in this particular fashion. For out of Zion shall come forth the Torah and the davar of the Lord from Jerusalem. And hence the idea here is to follow God's instructions, right? God's path. All right. In verse 4, I would say verse 4 would be probably one of the most famous prophecies of the end times. And to understand what is end times, we were given an imagery of the house of God up in the mountains. The people, the nations of the world are streaming uphill. They want to learn the directions and the word of the Lord as how they should live. But in verse 4 is more popular than those other verses. He shall judge between the nations. He would be who? He would be the Lord. And then he will rebuke many people. The idea of rebuke is to reprove. He will correct. All right. And the word judge is also to in a way it gives us a picture of to correct as well, to explain judgments, what is right and wrong, right? Right and wrong. And that is the judgment. And that's what we see, an A and a B. And this is they would be the nations, they would be the people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And so now we have another A and B, and A and B. Now this is important for us to note, because all of these is talking about world peace. So in the end days, there will be world peace. That's the picture that's given to us. Not just the temple of God that people want to learn from God, but the most popular would be these words, that instruments of war are converted into instruments of agriculture, instruments of war into instruments of fishery. Sword is not used against nation. They do not learn to war or fight each other anymore. And hence that would be the picture of world peace. Let me give you a picture of why this is so important to people. We know that this is one of the most popular verses of prophecy, that whether you believe in God or otherwise, people tend to use this verse from Isaiah of world peace. They would ignore all the rest of the verses and the words around it, and they just take these 2 lines, 3 lines, and it starts from here and ends here and calls it Isaiah. This is called the Isaiah Wall. This Isaiah Wall is at the United Nations building. Now you notice that the entire Isaiah Wall talks only about Isaiah, but says nothing about the Jews, because, well, the United Nations don't quite like the Jews. But they like these words here because they give and ring out clearly world peace, that people should not fight each other. But yet in the United Nations, they are dealing more with war than anything else. And this is how they use verses. They take out the verses above and the verses below because they only like these words. Now, that's how the world uses the Bible, as motivational quotes, as things which they like some of these words. In fact, many of the words they like, but the words they don't like, they just strip off and ignore. Verse 5. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Now, understand that when we get to verse 5, it is now a rebuke. It is a rebuke of Jerusalem, of Judah, and Jerusalem. That's what we read in verse 1. And the appeal is, come, as an action, as a very conscious action that you move towards God. Let us walk. Now, the word walk has no magical meaning. The word walk in verse 5 here is halak. It's used, I think, if I'm not mistaken, around 5,000 odd times in the Bible. And you would think that the Bible is a very exercise-driven book. And the word walk really gives us the picture of literally walking, like Abraham walked to where God was to point him in the land of Canaan. And so let us walk in the light of the Lord. And the light of the Lord represents order. Right? The word light is or. That's why we get the word order. The light of the Lord shows order. The light of the Lord shows what God wants them to do. And so for you have forsaken your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with eastern ways. They are soothsayers like the Philistines. They are pleased with the children of foreigners. Who is you? That's God, right? The Lord. The Lord has forsaken his people. What does forsaken mean? Natash, God has promised his people when they are walking with him, right here, when they are walking with him, that he will not forsake them. And here the word forsake is to abandon. It means to reject. But this is God's people, the house of Yaakov. And the reason why God is rejecting them is because they are filled with eastern ways. What are eastern ways? Eastern ways. By eastern, it would mean that cultures that's coming from east of Israel. People who are east of Israel will move towards the Moab and all the way to Chaldea. Right? They are soothsayers like the Philistines, which are their perennial enemies on the coastal area of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, what are soothsayers? The word soothsayers literally means six. Literally means people who practice sorcery and magic. And in this case, this would be people who are very observant. Right? Soothsayers are very observant people. And I suppose if you're familiar with characters like Sherlock Holmes, observant people appear to have extraordinary knowledge and perhaps extraordinary knowledge of the past and perhaps ability to predict the future. And that would be the term soothsayer. And they are pleased with the children of foreigners, and foreigners would be people who are non-Israel. Non-Israel. In this case, they are aliens. All of these are things which they are not supposed to do. It says their land is full of silver and gold. There's no end to their treasures, full of horses, chariots. Now, all of these are indicators of self-reliance. So is soothsayer. When you trust in soothsayer, you don't trust God. And that would be why God forbid them to do that. The next thing is their land is full of idols. They worship work of their hands, which they have made with their fingers. What would this be? Idolatry. And so now you're beginning to see why the rebuke towards Judah and Jerusalem is to correct all that they have done wrong. People bow down. Verse 9, when we say bow down, this comes from the word shakach, right? S-H-A-C-H-A-C-H. Shakach. Shakach means to bow down to the ground. It is not bow down your head. It is bow down to the ground, because shakach is obeisance. It's the way the ancients give honor to other people. When you come across, say, a more powerful person, and we read this in Genesis chapter 18, Abraham bowed down to the angels. When we see Abraham treating the sons of Heth when he was buying Machpelah for the burial plot, he treated them as the more powerful because they owned the land. When they bow down to a king, when they bow down to other people. And so these are the words for shakach. To bow down means to pay honor and homage. And by this, each man humbles himself. Therefore, do not forgive them. And essentially, Isaiah is saying, even if they bow down and show that they are humble, don't forgive them. I want to pick up from last week, yesterday, and I would use that example at the end. They enter into the rock, hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. This gives us a picture of the fear of God, fearing God. This gives us a picture, the lofty looks of men, haughtiness of men, humble down, bow down, both are A and B. It's talking about the pride, and this is the brokenness of pride that God has to destroy, because God alone shall be exalted in that day. Whenever you say that day, it generally refers to Judgment Day. Now, in Judgment Day, it need not necessarily mean the final Judgment Day. And I would think that this Judgment Day is when Babylon comes, that God is using to judge them. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty. These are the same words, is A and B. Upon everything lifted up. Anything lifted up is about pride. Anything that you lift up above, that you express pride, is located in a higher ground. These three is about pride. Three different words. And they shall be brought low. And the word brought low in verse 12 would be the word sink down or humble down, right? Humbled. Or sink down. Which means this is the opposite. And so God don't like the pride, because the proud people think that they don't need God. And so when the day of the Lord of hosts come, God is going to show them who God is. And the Lord of hosts, Yehovah Tzevaot, will come and judge his people. Upon all the cedars of Lebanon, high and lifted up, upon all the oaks of Bashan. These are also A and B. These are tall trees. We are still in the theme of pride. These are the picture of pride. Upon all the high mountains, upon all the hills that are lifted up, upon every high tower, upon every fortified wall. Fortified wall would be high walls. So you can see that all of these are A and B, A and B. They are using similar words, right? Upon all the ships of Tarshish, upon all the beautiful sloops. Verse 16 gives us this picture of what is desirable. Sloops is delight. Okay, this is delight. And Tarshish are great boats. Okay, this is also another A and B. These are beautiful things. And so what we can see is when we read 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, they are all about the case against Judah and Jerusalem. Verse 17. Verse 17, this would be haughtiness. Loftiness is haughtiness, pride. The pride of man, and in this case, general man, shall be brought down. Brought down is shakach. Let me just give you the word. And this would be bow to the ground. Now, in the normal word, this bow down would be an action that you pay homage, that you pay honor to somebody greater than you. But in this verse itself, the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, based on the context, is to show that the pride that is all the way up, high up, shall be brought down to the ground. So the word bow down here would mean all the way to the ground. The haughtiness, and the word haughtiness here of men actually means the height of men. And so these two words also mean pride. Shall be brought low. The word shall be brought low the high part of the word shall be brought low is about separation. It's about separation. Below the will be low. Okay, and in this case, you find that the word brought low is to be low, to be humble, to sink down, to be humbled, to sink down. Basically, to tell us when somebody is high up, God is going to bring them down to the ground. Right? The word shakha, bow to the ground, is prostrating all the way onto the ground. And so in the generic use of the word, it is to give honor. But in this context, it is literally to give us a picture that it is on the ground. And it is a contrast of pride. And it's telling us that on that day, in that day, only God will be exalted. The idols shall be utterly abolished. God hates idols. There shall be no other gods before me. What does that mean? It means that there should be nothing that comes after God. So when they practice idolatry, God says the idols he shall utterly abolish. It's, how should we say? The picture here is to tell us that it will pass away. It will pass away. I guess it will be lost and forgotten. So utterly abolish is a modern English word, but the picture in Hebrew is that it will pass away. It will go away. It will vanish, right? The idols shall go into holes of the rocks, into the caves of the earth, from the terror of the Lord, and the glory of his majesty. when he arises to shake the earth mightily. This gives us a picture of the time of the Messianic age, when God displays his glory and his power. And understand this, glory and power is not an imagination. It all can be seen. And so the Hebrew words are given such that the reader, the hearer, like ourselves, when we hear the words, we can actually imagine the video in our minds. In that day, a man, whenever he says a man, it really means humanity. So it's man in general. It's not talking about the Jews. In that day, when the day of the Lord comes, man will cast away his idols of silver, his idols of gold, which they made for himself to worship. In verse 20, the word worship is to shakah, right? And this really gives us the whole picture of bowing down again. So as I had mentioned to you in the past, worship is an English modern word. In the Hebrew, it's just the same action. It's about bowing down. And when it is applied to an idol, and so they would treat the idol as someone or something which is greater than they are. When this word is applied to God, when we pay homage to God, then it means that we are treating God as the utmost creator. And they made for themselves to the moles and bats, and some say that these idols look like moles and bats. I really am not sure. Another way of looking at it, as some people have said, that these are all done in hidden, because moles and bats are not common creatures of the open. They are always in hiding. That's a possible way when they worship in secret, right? In secret. Either that or that's how they look like. To go into the clefts of the rocks, into the cracks of the rugged rocks, all of this is A and B. It's about hiding. Hiding from God. Remember, we saw that earlier? From the terror of the Lord. Now, in verse 21, when we say the terror of the Lord, this is pachad. This is trembling. The trembling that God himself will exude, that will cause people to feel the dread. Why would God do that? Because God would be the judge. If God is ultimately the judge and these people have been doing wrong, has been worshiping idols, when God says, "You shall have no other gods before me," and then when the narrative goes into talking about how God is going to judge, then the terror or the trembling of the Lord literally means that the trembling that comes from God to them, the trembling that is initiated by God, that they will feel the terror, they will feel the dread of the judgment of God. And the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. And you know, this is about judgment again. The picture of all these that we have seen up to verse 21 is about the power of God in judgment. We seldom think of God in judgment. And the next judgment that comes from this narrative would really be the Babylonian exile, when King Nebuchadnezzar would come down hard on Judah and take them all away, and then eventually destroy the city and the temple. We cannot imagine nor fathom the imagery in our mind, how incredibly awesome from a negative sense, from a standpoint of shock, that God is going to impose on his people. Let me wrap up verse 22 and let me then come back to the example. He says in verse 22, sever yourself. The word sever here means to stop, to cease. Okay, come to an end, leave off. And it says, don't be with such people. What people? The people who are unjust, who are violent, and who are idolaters, whose breath is in his nostrils. For what account is he? This actually gives us a picture of the how should we say, the humanity of man, the temporalness of man, that man is merely breath. When we read in Genesis chapter 7 and 8, and when God used the deluge, the flood, and the water rose up and destroyed everything with breath, it means that they can be easily destroyed. And God made us so. And so if man does all these things right here, all of these, and so Isaiah said, you should then cancel yourself from such people. Do not associate with them. And so within the rebuke comes what we call words of encouragement and words of instruction. And so by way of conclusion, let me explain to you the example that I gave yesterday when we parted. When a father gives the keys to a car to a son and tells them to come back before midnight, and he doesn't, and he does that again and again, and then he comes back later, and then he gets into an accident, and then he gets into a worse accident, and then he uses the car to do something that is illegal. Now, as a parent, forgiveness and grace comes only so far. And at the end of the day, tough love may have to be invoked. That if you don't listen, the father would then decide, why don't you sit in jail for a while and reflect on what has happened. And that's the situation where Judah and Jerusalem is rushing head on towards. That they are numbed towards the rebuke of God, and they keep doing all the things that God doesn't want them to do. And yesterday we have seen, they come and say, oh, I give all my sacrifices, I give all these things in the temple. And then God says, I don't want them. Why? Because it is disgraceful, it's disgusting, because they do not treat the people who are weak, who are poor, who are fatherless, who are widows. These are the weak ones of their society, and they are dealing with them with injustice. And God says, if you correct that, then though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. And God says, let us reason. Let us argue this out. You think you're right? I am telling you, this is what is right. This is what I want. Because now the sacrifices stinks in the eyes of God. And God wants them to correct their ways. And so the picture of the hope is to tell them that even though when things are going to be really bad, one day God will reset the world with world peace. And with that, we end chapter 2.